Okay, I'd like to just expand on what was written on page 156. In addition to those comments, when you are drawing from observation, a couple of things that can help you to draw from your imagination. Drawing from observation, like from a photograph or from real life on site, is it's interesting because to draw accurately this car, for instance, in perspective, from observation, we don't actually need to understand much at all about perspective drawing. And what I mean by that, let's just replicate this guy here on the right. Okay, roughly about there. Okay, so when I look at something from observation and I'm trying to draw it, what matters, in this case we have a frame that I'm using as reference, but if we're not drawing from a photograph, we're drawing from real life, we would ignore the horizontal and vertical and try to imagine a vertical, like we could reference some of these buildings behind us or something. But what you look for are angles and shapes. Okay, and what I mean by that is that I see this line here. Okay, and if I can get that angle right, maybe somewhere about like that, if I can get that angle correct, and then the next big angle would be here. And of course, that's setting up our right vanishing point and our left vanishing point. But to draw from observation, do I really need to know that? I actually don't really need to know that. All I really need to know is that they make shapes. And so when you're drawing from observation, you can actually just focus on making the shapes themselves and not worry about perspective. I haven't done this in forever, so I'm sure I'm going to be rusty at it. So it's about getting the proportions of all the shapes correct, not necessarily about worrying about the convergence. So I'll look at this little cut line right here, try to draw that up, and then I estimate where the center is, and then I just look at the curve, look at the shape, and then try to draw it, and look at the curve. I see that it comes back into there, and then I look for those little taillights, and I know this one's straight across. Now, of course, because we know a little bit more about perspective, we would start to draw guidelines, of course, to help our drawing be more accurate. But you don't actually need that. What you really need to do is just look for the shapes and their relationship to each other, and you can start to quickly approximate, this car form in perspective. So you don't really need to know about all the perspective stuff. Well, that's not very helpful for a perspective drawing book, right? So let's talk about what you can take out of this exercise. And this is one, and I got to say, this whole reason why I don't do a lot of observational drawing, especially when trying to teach people how to draw from their imagination, is that it's quite easy to get good at drawing things. Oops, this is not very good, I should say, but so there's a little more of a gap in there, so you just keep making adjustments. Got a little running board in there. So the idea, my proportions are off, as you can see, but I'm not taking that much time to observe it. If I was, I would basically just put in a few more guidelines, but it wouldn't be guidelines for perspective, it would be guidelines for proportion. So I'd say, oh, well, the top of my image is here, or what I'm observing in, and the top of the car is really in there somewhere. So I would just come in here and start to modify the proportions, right? And then it would look more and more like the thing that I was observing. So by modifying those proportions, you can make it look more like the real object. So your focus is really about shapes as they relate to each other. To get the proportions correct, that provides the realism. But when you want to change it, or you want to draw something from your imagination, it requires a whole different set of skills. And that's really what this book is all about, is to give you those skills and the section drawing to draw things right from your imagination that the world has never seen before. Because you want to be the person that creates this car, as opposed to drawing the car as it exists. So what can you take out of this? Well, here's some things to think about. When you're drawing cars like this, or anything, a building, people, anything, think about anatomy. Think about observing the details, observing that it has taillights, that it has a bumper, that we see an exhaust pipe poking out from underneath the bumper, right? Observe that it has rims and a little center in the wheel, and there's a design on the wheel. It has some vents here, and then it has a side mirror, right? And it's got a little, looks like a little logo light thing there. It's got a door cut. It's got another cut line here to allow access to the rear wheel. Okay, those are the things that you want to start to learn, right? And so you're going to be building your visual library when you draw from observation. So you can learn that, oh, if I want to make a car look real and I'm going to cover the rear wheel in the future, I better put a cut line there to give access to that wheel so it can be changed. And those are all the kinds of things that make these kinds of drawings important and helpful to draw from your imagination, because as you build that visual library, oh, I remember I drew this little cool fin that was coming off that trunk of that car at the car show. That goes into your visual library and you can reference that in the future. And then using the techniques that we've shared with you throughout the book with section drawing and guidelines, you can actually start to incorporate these design elements, inspiration of the design elements, or the combination of cut lines and materials and anatomy into something that's original, right, from scratch without any reference. So I think they're important to do. I think they're definitely helpful, but not for maybe the reasons you would think. And I think the way that you do them is really not in the same way that I would draw perspective sketching, right? I don't need to do guidelines. I really just have to I have to imagine this if it was from reality and not from a photograph, which is also reality, but if I'm there on site, what you need to do is imagine the three-dimensional world in stereoscopic vision as being flat. You can do that by closing one eye. And then you get rid of stereoscopic vision and parallax shifting, and the world becomes flat and it looks just like a drawing. And so if you can imagine, right, the world as being flat, not the topography, but right, getting rid of parallax shifting and stereoscopic vision, it makes it much easier to translate those shapes to a two-dimensional flat plane, which is drawing is. Drawing is the illusion of three dimensions, right, on a 2D plane. And so when you want to try to recreate reality from observation, it's really about sharpening your observation skills and getting the relationship right between the proportions. So to get the relationship right between the proportions, I might imagine a vertical line touching tangent to this rear fender, and I notice that it goes right, through the window overlaps that vertical a little bit. So if I went over here, then I could say, okay, that has to overlap a little bit, right? And then, oh, this front's a little bit higher. And then where is that in relation to the rear here? Oh, that's where that ends. That's where this is supposed to end. And then you just start to hone those things and make subtle adjustments, moving lines here and there. But you can see I'm not using guidelines for perspective. I'm using guidelines for proportions and the alignment of those shapes in relationship to each other. And so that's a different skill set, one that we're not spending a lot of time on in this book, because our whole focus is to create things from your imagination. And to do that, it's much more akin to model building, and that's why all the techniques that we've shared so far. So the other couple of videos in this chapter are going to be about drawing some cars from your imagination, which we're going to rely upon much more the section drawing skills taught earlier. But by all means do this. Builds your visual library. You learn a lot about car anatomy. And I'm saying cars, but you can apply it to any subject, products, buildings, people. You'll commit that to memory, and it makes it much easier than when you're drawing from your imagination to bring realism to the things that you create, because you already have these things. And by drawing them, they go into your visual library much, much more than just snapping a photo and trying to look at it and think you're going to remember all these details. You won't, but if you draw it, you will remember it much, much better. And then it'll be usable. So I definitely encourage you to do them and enjoy doing them, but you can think about them a little bit differently. You can think about it shape first, proportion, and anatomy, all with a focus to build your visual library. And then we can apply the section drawing skills and perspective knowledge you have to go and create cool stuff from your imagination, which is next. So let's get there.